This is a reading from Esther. This is the story of something that happened in the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all. King Xerxes ruled from his royal throne in the palace complex of Susa. In the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his officials and ministers. The military brass of Persia and Media were also there, along with the princes and governors of the provinces. For 6 months, he put on exhibit. Oh, thank you. For 6 months, he put on exhibit the huge wealth of his empire and its stunningly beautiful royal splendors. At the conclusion of the exhibit, the king threw a week-long party for everyone living in Susa, the capital, important and unimportant alike. The party was in the garden courtyard of the king's summer house. The courtyard was elaborately decorated with white and blue cotton curtains tied with linen and purple cords to silver rings on marble columns. Silver and gold couches were arranged on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and colored stones. Drinks were served in gold chalices, each chalice one of a kind. The royal wine flowed freely, a generous king. The guests could drink as much as they liked, king's orders, with waiters at their elbows to refill their drinks. Meanwhile, Queen Vashti was throwing a separate party for women inside King Xerxes' royal palace. On the 7th day of the party, the king, high on the wine, ordered the 7 eunuchs who were his personal servants, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abathka, Zehar, and Karkas, to bring him Queen Vashti, resplendent in her royal crown. He wanted to show off her beauty to the guests and officials. She was extremely good-looking. But Queen Vashti refused to come, refused the summons delivered by the eunuchs. The king lost his temper. Seething with anger over her insolence, the king called in his counselors, all experts in legal matters. It was the king's practice to consult his expert advisors. Those closest to him were Katrina, Shahar, Abmatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 highest-ranking princes of Persia and Media, the inner circle with access to the king's ear. He asked them what legal recourse they had against Queen Vashti for not obeying King Xerxes' summons delivered by the eunuchs. Memucan spoke up in the council of the king and princes. It's not only the king Queen Vashti has insulted, it's all of us, leaders and people alike in every last one of King Xerxes' provinces. The word's going to get out. Did you hear the latest about Queen Vashti? King Xerxes ordered her to be brought before him, and she wouldn't do it. When the women hear it, they'll start treating their husbands with contempt. The day the wives of the Persian and Mede officials get word of the queen's brazenness, they'll be out of control. Is that what we want? A country of angry women who don't know their place? So, if the king agrees, let him pronounce a royal ruling and have it recorded in the laws of the Persians and Medes so that it cannot be revoked, that Vashti is permanently banned from King Xerxes' presence. And then let the king give her royal position to a woman who knows her place. When the king's ruling becomes public knowledge throughout the kingdom, extensive as it is, every woman, regardless of her social position, will show proper respect to her husband. The king and the princes liked this. The king did what Memucan proposed. He sent bulletins to every part of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, to each people in their own language. Every man is a master of his house. Whatever he says goes. There ends the reading.
I have to say, I'm relieved that you're laughing already. You're getting the spirit of this book. There was not a, but I'm going to guess that this story is unfamiliar for most of us. It's not in our lectionary, so we don't normally hear it in our cycle of readings. Maybe you've heard of Esther, the character for whom the whole book is titled, but of course she doesn't appear in this chapter. She comes in the next chapter. I became acquainted with this story when my son Walter was a 3-year-old at Temple Ner Tamid's preschool. Every winter, the kids there are invited to dress up to celebrate the festival of Purim. The grown-ups are invited to come in as the rabbi and cantor lead the telling of the story of Purim with help from the children. Kids in costume are cute, we all know this, and memorable. It's also memorable the way that they tell the story. The kids are told to hiss every time the name Haman is said. He becomes a villain later in the story. And they also laugh and encourage heckling as the story is told. Think chancel steps on Halloween. And I think that Walter still probably knows the story of Purim better than any story in the Gospels, including Christmas. There's something about dramatization and comedy that resonates. So most scholars think that this book, the Book of Esther, was included in the canon of the Hebrew Bible as an explainer for the festival of Purim. We didn't get that far in the story, but that's sort of where things end up. To give us a little wider summary of the whole book to understand the story of Queen Vashti, here's the 3-sentence version. One of the advisors to the king, whose name is Haman, plots a genocide of the Jewish people. Queen Esther and her cousin Mordecai are heroes who foil this plan, and Queen Vashti paves the way for Esther's ascent to the throne. For today's purposes, that's all you need to know. But you should also know that scholars have identified this as a work of fiction. This is not a true story about real people or connected to any known historical events. It's a work of literature. Think a New Yorker short story, Shakespeare comedy, maybe even something in the range of O. Henry. And I think that our Jewish partners in faith have appropriately taken the tone of this story into their festival of Purim. It is one of levity, of humor, and sense of trickery. But even so, this book stands out from most of our other sacred texts, and it's worth pondering the place of this story in our canon. Why is this here? It's one of 2 books in the Hebrew Bible named for a woman, the other being Ruth. It's also one of 2 books in the Hebrew Bible with no direct mention of God, or even of the law or Torah. What is sacred about this story? Deborah Sawyer writes that we encounter Queen Vashti, a foreign figure in biblical terms, in a post-exilic narrative set in the Persian diaspora, where God's elect people are in a hostile environment and under threat. The God of Israel does not appear as a character in this narrative, but the context of this book within the Jewish canon of Scripture allows for the divine agenda to be extended into the text. By reading the text within its canonical framework, we can see that the various characters are fulfilling particular roles that testify to the central tenets of biblical theology, to God's omnipotence and the well-being of God's people. Placed at the beginning of the narrative, Queen Vashti serves to highlight the moral depravity of King Ahasuerus and his royal court. The character Haman, the archetypal villain who will come later, intensifies this amoral context with his intent to initiate a pogrom against the Jews. Vashti's story has been seen as an optional anecdote rather than a vital component in the central story of Esther, serving merely as a literary vehicle to explain why there is a vacancy for a new queen that leads to Esther's rise. But if we pause and examine the details within this short chapter, it becomes evident that the author was conveying more than a convenient entrance for Esther. If we look at Vashti and Esther side by side, we see that this book provides us with 2 clear types of female resistance in the face of male absolute power. The first, by Vashti, is direct confrontation, a pure refusal. And the second, performed by Esther, is more familiar to us in biblical literature. It's a pragmatic approach. In sum, while Vashti refuses to display her physical beauty, Esther deliberately cultivates hers as a means to her end. But both are focused on gaining liberation for their people. Queen Vashti's resistance is essential for the survival of the Hebrews, for the survival of God's people. And wherever the struggle for survival and liberation is ongoing, there God is, visible, not always in outward or obvious signs, but sometimes in surreptitious and creative acts. Sometimes when the oppressed, like Vashti, say no, loudly and clearly. And sometimes, like Esther, when they gain influence and meet survival from the inside. So this is a story that lifts up multiple modes of creative female resistance and is worth celebrating as a part of our scriptures. But there's more too. I think this story shows us a place for humor, for creativity and parody, even and maybe especially when we seek the divine. Vashti's story can be boiled down to the simple point, the ironic point, that when she dares to say no to the king and to ask to never again be in his presence, her punishment is to never again be in his presence. And the king's worst nightmare is that women throughout the kingdom would hear Vashti's story, and ironically, he sends a decree that is to be read to every household that tells of Vashti's rebellion. Biblically speaking, this is comedic gold. As Mona West writes, the king attempts to show his power with the extravagance of his ability to throw parties for his officials, his armies, and all the people of Susa, or at least all the men. Jeannie so wonderfully read of the gold chalices and the different, textures and fabrics and feasts that they would have. But he finds that his power is usurped with one woman's refusal to come before him. Vashti's refusal threatens male power to the point that it must be legislated. And the parody continues in that the very decree that gives Vashti her wish to not come before the king does also the very thing that the men are trying to prevent, spreading the news of Vashti's rebellion. The reading ends with the king's decree. Every man is a master of his own house. Whatever he says goes. But of course, the story has just shown us that even the king is not the master of his own house. For Vashti has, with a simple no, shown that every power has its limits. I saw the Barbie movie this week. Anybody else? Yeah? And I couldn't help but see the parallels between the campy film of Barbies and Kens grappling with patriarchy and matriarchy and this ancient parody of patriarchal and feminist power. Vashti and Barbie and the Festival of Purim can remind us that we don't always need to take ourselves so seriously, even when the topics are very serious. That perhaps even God has a sense of humor. That unlike the kings of this world, who can't take a joke, who take everything as an affront to their power, God is capable of play, of creative resistance, of showing up with clever picket sign slogans, to lavish parties in works of literature and film, and whose presence is passed down in part by stories that have transformed moments of trauma into divine comedies that offer some distance from and perspective on the serious matter of the survival of God's people and the balance of power in our societies. There are so many situations in this world that can make us cry, rage, be sick to our stomachs, or hopeless enough to never get out of bed. There is unimaginable suffering and cruelty. Dancers stabbed in gas station parking lots. Families forced to trek thousands of miles and then left without even a bed to sleep in. Those in power with the intent to stoke chaos and consolidate power. There is sickness and death and loneliness and pain. The stories of our sacred texts reflect all of that. And that has all been true for millennia. And through it all, God's people have found resilience through creative resistance and even a sense of humor. May God continue to have mercy on us. And may we continue to find the grace of a good story, especially one that might raise an eyebrow, make us laugh, and encourage us to continue seeking the sacred and creating a more just world for one more day. May it be so.